You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week, Stephanie Gidigbi, Jenkins, and Helen Chin are back to talk about the one-year anniversary of the infrastructure bill. They chat about what they liked, what opportunities are available, and how some states have been stepping up to the challenge. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, past, present, and future. We really can't thank you all enough for the support, whether you've supported for a month or over 5 years. Join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards and support Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. $2 a month gets you stickers, including our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks everyone from the advocates to the bus drivers that support this show. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire to support. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also get our transportation scarves, sign up for our daily newsletter started in 2006, or get our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, in the show notes, you'll find links to the bookshop.org affiliate store and link to purchase some of our Cars Are Cholesterol merch designed with the great help of Richard Wazensky. Follow him on Instagram at DickDavidSketches if you get a chance. Thanks for all your support, and we look forward to sharing with you what's next. Stephanie Gidigbi, Jenkins, and Helen Chin, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast. I should say, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
Hey, Jeff.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be back.
I'm very excited to have you all back. Last time you were on, you had a good one-on-one conversation with each other about the infrastructure bill and all those things. Our friend Tanya Snyder at Politico, who used to be actually my co-host on the show, had an article out the other day that shared a poll in which like 76% of voters didn't even know that the infrastructure bill had passed. And so, I know a lot of Republicans didn't vote for it and were campaigning on it because they knew no one would really check them outside of a tweet that nobody would see. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on like how deep the infrastructure bill got into the consciousness of the United States and American voters.
So I definitely agree with Tanya's research, which is that many folks don't actually know what we mean, even when we're talking about infrastructure and then the passage of it. That's the other piece. I think we should also just put into context last year and all that was happening. We were still dealing with the pandemic. They had just passed the stimulus bill in the springtime. And then literally last year around this time, we were then passing the infrastructure bill. And so it's just been a lot of different spending bills, a lot of different discussions. The infrastructure bill was originally part of the Build Back Better plan. It was like all these iterations of plans and visions that folks were like trying to figure out what is first and second, and things got separated out, things got put back together. So I could both see the confusion and also the lack of understanding, in addition to the fact that we literally are now just coming out of our homes. So I'm not sure how much folks were really grounding themselves into all of the things that were happening last year at this time, even in this moment. The other thing that I would add is I think we are seeing this conversation as to like, what's up first, second, and third, and part even amongst movement and advocacy groups. It's just a lot of different, very large spending bills that have real implications, but not necessarily a full understanding of what it means both now and for the long term, which is a little scary, actually.
I'm really interested in this because it has been a year, but at the same time, because it has such a long runway in terms of how much funding there is, and especially this bill and the Inflation Reduction Act, there's so much stuff in it and it takes so long for it to kind of roll out. I'm curious if you've seen anything come out of this, if you've seen any positive results from this, or if you haven't seen any results from this and you're just waiting, or are you frustrated with anything that's happened so far?
So I would say that I'm still deeply encouraged by the progress that has happened in many ways, at least at the administration level, because Congress didn't necessarily put in mechanisms around, or even performance measures around climate, around equity, particularly for the infrastructure bill. What we have is an opportunity to actually build a lot of the things, maybe with more of the values that we hope to see. And I think the administration has put out guidance immediately following the passage as to really centering those things that could help to transform our society for the better. We'll see how that plays itself out depending on the final outcomes of the election. I think the other piece, even with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, is the reality is we are trying to tackle multiple things in real time. And the combined resources made available means that we could do it in an intentional and comprehensive way. if folks are intentional. Otherwise, it's going to be more of the same and actually create or cause even deeper harm that we've seen. And I think that's the biggest both challenge in this moment of folks not being aware of what's happening, and also the struggle of being able to really allow for folks to understand the magnitude. And I think something that I said the last call that we had with you that I want to emphasize on this call is that the magnitude of this funding is what I think people are missing. When we were bailing out the banks in 2009 with the American Recovery Act funding, we were talking about 800 billion with a B. That's half the money that we're talking about for the Inflation Reduction Act climate portion of the bill. But then when we think about the stimulus funding, the recovery funding that was offered, we were talking about $1.9 trillion. And then the infrastructure bill is 1.2. So we've got almost 4 times the amount of money that we spent over a decade ago. And at that time, they had 6 years. We have 4 years for this to all be spent down. So both the magnitude and the time span that folks have to make some real intentional decisions is really the biggest concern for me, and the importance of us being able to elevate why this matters.
What's been interesting to me, and Stephanie and I were just reflecting the last couple of days around the anniversary of the infrastructure bill being passed, is that what you're seeing at the local level is that folks are still trying to just navigate the COVID dollars that they got through the American Rescue Plan. Like the final tranche of those resources were allocated in mid-October, and folks are still trying to figure out, like, what do I do with this? How do I use these dollars to address my immediate needs? And they don't even have the bandwidth to really think about that. This next wave of dollars is coming through with the build money. So I think folks are in a place where, they're trying to play catch up and really connect to what the opportunities are. And I think one of the things that's most important, especially for folks like a Communities First or other intermediaries that are trying to help navigate in this space, is trying to give people the space of abundance to sit, think, and actually develop strategy to be able to connect to these dollars in a more meaningful way. The other thing that Stephanie brings up a lot is that during the American Rescue Plan, ARPA, what the administration was really intentional about is actually having a level of accountability for how those dollars were going to be spent. So governors put forward like a plan, like you had to be intentional, like how are these dollars actually going to help those most impacted as it relates to COVID? And in that moment, what you saw was, I feel like, a very intentional and thoughtful articulation around how we were going to be equitable around the distribution of these dollars. And for me, I feel like that may be a gateway to thinking about then how we program for the infrastructure dollars, because what we're seeing is that, as Stephanie mentioned, those dollars have hit the street with no guidance. And we're going to have to be thoughtful because, again, this is over $1 trillion that are going to be spent. And the concern on one hand is that what we're doing is just putting more money on top of what is an existing problem or existing bad infrastructure. But if we could be thoughtful about this, it could be an opportunity to actually repair a lot of our infrastructure. It could be a way to think and transform our infrastructure so that it's actually serving all communities. So that's one of the things that brings me a little hope and joy at the end of the day, the proposition of that.
Yeah.
The only thing that I want to add specifically on the state and local recovery plans that were issued was that Treasury actually asked the question around how are you going to ensure that your plans are implemented equitably? Like every state had to answer that question. And they also had to answer the question around how are you intentionally leading and supporting community engagement? And I think for me, going back through those responses on the interim reports that each state had to submit, you would be so surprised by places like Florida and Georgia and Iowa and Kansas and the ways in which governors showed up at a whole different level and being accountable to their residents and centering those who are most at need. And so to me, it showcases, particularly because 90% of the infrastructure bill funding that got passed is going to be implemented at the state and local level, there's a great opportunity for us to have a different type of conversation around centering equity and centering those who are most at need. They did it already, literally. Like they had to submit a report that asked the question and they all put together, everyone had to respond. 2 did not, but the rest of the 48 did. And it's in the spaces and places that you would never have expected. It was the states that I didn't expect that had some really comprehensive strategies for how they were really centering their communities.
Well, you both mentioned making sure that the money is spent wisely and equitably. And I think that we're seeing right now some frustrations with some of the infrastructure money from the Reconnecting Communities program, which was supposed to have $20 billion, right? And then it got whittled down to, I think, about $1 billion. Maybe it got some extra money in the Inflation Reduction Act. But there's a lot of state DOTs that are applying for kind of old remedies for the problems that, highways that have split neighborhoods throughout history in the United States. And so instead of thinking about tearing down a highway in New Orleans, they're thinking about just taking away the off ramps. Or in another place, I can't remember exactly where it was, but there was an article in Streets Blog the other day about how one of the states wanted to, widen the underpass to just make it wider. Don't worry about, there's still going to be a highway there. And there were some advocates who were very frustrated by this, and they want to see something transformational and something equitable. And it seems like if we allow state DOTs and others who, their whole shtick is throughput and car orientation, if we see that go forward, it seems like, we're going to get business as usual, which is not what I think this bill was intended to do.
I completely agree that there's a real opportunity for folks to continue to advance the status quo, but there is also an opportunity to support transformative change. And, you gave a great highlight for the New Orleans Claiborne Expressway, because I feel like that is the example that has been elevated through several presidential administrations, really trying to solve for the challenges. There was a livability study. There was a Tiger at the time funding for it to really think about the plans underneath the expressway and along it. And what we really honestly heard as someone who had been sitting with a lot of the work and the different studies and plans was that residents shortly after the expressway got built also started to put a plan as to how to deal with it in its current structure. They recognized how much time it took for the project to actually get complete and the implications that it actually had on their communities. And I think no one would say that they want to keep it in place. It's aging, it's time for it to come down in a lot of ways, but it's more on the how and centering the who. And I think making sure that residents who live in that community, who have been there, really should be seen as the experts to help to inform the strategies for it. And the one thing that I will say about USDOT and the intentionality that they put even in describing the NOFA was that you needed to have had some sort of community letter, commitment, something. You weren't just coming to this application process by pulling something off the stip and tip with no public engagement. And I feel like typically that's not how this process has worked, even for the newest discretionary programs. It is requiring some level of community engagement, some level of conversation, and an intentionality from those who are eligible entities to really make the case for how they've done the level of outreach that's required. And I think it's hard because who speaks on behalf of community? What does that ultimately look like, especially when you work at the most localized level? You know the challenges because you'll have folks who believe it needs to be done one way or another. But I think ultimately finding both the balance and also the long-term solutions and incorporating those pieces, I think, is critical. So I think it's a long, short way to say we will need to hold folks accountable. And I think it starts with, really those who are at the highest levels of power to influence how those decisions are being made and being able to hold folks accountable to wanting to see community voice be part of it. But it's also going to require the advocates to really call folks to task. So even going back to the conversation that we were having with governors, they went and did an amazing recovery plan and had to answer to Treasury as to how they were spending the money equitably in center community. And to date, when we've done a scan of governors and their action on infrastructure, there are only a handful of states that have actually put or set any priorities around their infrastructure spending, like transportation, water, broadband. Like all those pieces. And it's like, how did you go from receiving money and you had water in it, you had housing, you had transportation, and even greater flexibility guidance offered, and you put in all the right things, and then you get this infrastructure money and it's just business as usual. So it does mean that we're going to have to hold folks accountable and say, hey, you got this money, what's the plans for it? And whether that's at the legislative level, whether that's folks going and having conversations, asking for those executive orders that set priorities. I think there's a full spectrum of things that folks can do in this moment.
You know, if so many voters and folks don't really know, what happened in the infrastructure bill, I'm wondering why then we couldn't be more bold about what we put in it, and why there was all this horse trading going on about this program and that program. And maybe it's because it was passed by a small amount of Republicans as well, that they didn't attack it as much. And so maybe that's why it didn't get as much attention. But, there's a lot of stuff that kind of got cut out and left on the floor that maybe if nobody was paying attention, maybe it should have been in there.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this is a real place for advocates more specifically, because I feel like folks felt like they had to negotiate. They had to just kind of go with the tide that was flowing in that moment. And they accepted some really harmful aspects of the bill. And, it's interesting. Some folks look at this infrastructure bill and say, well, it's a transportation bill with a couple of other projects added to it. And you could think about it that way, but no one lives single issue lives. So the fact that we can have a bill that is comprehensive, intentional, and really trying to address multiple issue areas, I think is a good direction for how maybe future Congresses can think about how we invest in our long-term infrastructure projects more broadly. But I also hope that folks won't settle for the path of least resistance. And, I recognize that it was the strongest bill possible while trying to tackle inflation and cut deficits and reduce healthcare costs. I mean, especially for that Inflation Reduction Act, it was like everything in the kitchen sink. And it's not enough. It's not an all of the above strategy doesn't work if it's still harmful for those who are most impacted. And if nothing else is taken away from this commentary, I think that is a very critical aspect. And particularly for that Inflation Reduction Act bill, it was really sold to many folks as a climate bill, when less than 2% actually censored those who are most impacted. The majority of it were tax credits, which means you actually have to have money to buy the things. And we're in a moment where we're saying that everything is too high and we can't afford it. So it's like, who is ultimately really benefiting from these decisions that are being made? And how do we hold folks accountable at every level to ensure that we have something different for the outcomes? I hope that it offers us a space to dream, to build, to vision differently. And I want to emphasize something that Helen said about this moment and kind of sitting in a space of abundance. I think for many advocates, we're often working from a deficit strategy. We only have this much amount of time and we can only do but so much. And while the infrastructure bill doesn't solve all of our challenges, it definitely does make a good start to do something different and see the possibilities for what we can build and grow together to do. And I really hope that advocates can really be in this space to think about how do they not advocate for more of the same. Because in many ways, we're writing our history for this generation and the next. And I'm hoping that we can feel proud of what we fought for together.
And as I think about the horse trading, as you said, that went on, as we've seen in many administrations, there's been an attempt to pass some sort of comprehensive infrastructure bill. Outside of a transportation bill, we don't really have infrastructure at the federal level within Congress that like mandates around water, that mandates really around housing. Transportation has been the only thing because of the reauthorization that we have every 5 years. So I think I'm going to apply a little bit of grace, like meaning this was the opportunity to be able to do something that was more robust. And this is what we got. And for me, $1 trillion is a lot of money. So I see the horse trading, but I'm also going to extend some grace and this was the first opportunity. Where I really saw horse trading and where it hurts my heart and where there's a lot of disappointment has been around the Inflation Reduction Act. I felt like a ton of concessions were made. And the framing is, but this is the climate bill and we did well by it. It is not the climate bill. As Stephanie mentioned, less than 2% is actually going to go to climate. And it was, for me, the status quo around negotiation, where we gave 2% to address climate and to center those most impacted and give resources to them. But threefold, we gave money to the extractive industries to be able to continue to do what they need to do. So while communities have the ability to address mitigation and resiliency and take one step forward, they're going to have to move 5 steps back because of the concessions that were made to extractive industry, like the energy industry, to be able to play with tax credits, to be able to get resources in a different way. That, for me, is the thing that is problematic. And for me, also, when you think about the breadth of these dollars coming down, whether it's infrastructure or whether it's the money out of the Inflation Reduction Act, for me, the Inflation Reduction Act actually potentially can harm what's happening with the money that's going to move on the infrastructure money, because it's setting precedents of the status quo can continue to do what they want, and we're going to resource them over here without really being intentional around, like, if the infrastructure bill was really intended from the president's point of view to address what we need around climate, what we need to be able to build around our country. The thing is, there are no frameworks around that, and everyone is looking toward what has played itself out under the Inflation Reduction Act as potentially helping to set the tone. The two are at a disconnect. And for me, that horse trading set up a premise where it may be harder to actually put good practice in place, because folks are going to be putting their attention to, like, well, this is a climate bill. This is what it could mean. We can't do that. We have to acknowledge that there was concessions that were made, and then lean into then how do we make sure that there are accountability mechanisms so that those dollars are actually moving in a way that get to our climate goals, get to our resiliency goals, and get to supporting and building communities that have been harmed by past investments around infrastructure.
And I want to offer some clarity, because even when I described the 2%, what I'm saying is there was less than 2%. There were like some amazing programs that folks described that were going to help, communities of color, low-income communities, environmental justice communities. But the dollar amount, the actual investment, the grants that were actually, not the tax credits, but the grants that were actually going to go to people, that is what I'm saying that we're talking about was less than 2%. And I think it also, the narrative, particularly around climate, where it's an individual action, it's about reducing our carbon footprint, that even that narrative came from the oil industry. Like, they coined it, and it leaves little to no accountability to the actual industry doing right, and that they could actually be held accountable for being able to not choose to have multiple sources of energy options. Like, there's no incentive for them to do something different. And I think there's been so much emphasis on the individual and what they can do. And particularly for those who are most impacted by climate, they actually are the ones who create the largest harm. And the industries that have are now receiving incentives to hopefully do something different, but they haven't done that to date. And it feels so confusing sometimes, because when you hear the ads on TV, you're like, that's great, they're doing some amazing work. And it's like, yeah, no, there's no accountability for them to do anything different. So I think if nothing else is taken away, that accountability piece, I think, is critical as part of this conversation.
That's so interesting. I take your point too about, a lot of the tax credits and things in there. If you don't have money to buy a heat pump and then get the tax credit for it, then it's hard to say that that's benefiting the people that probably need it the most in the places that are probably overburdened by energy costs and things like that. So,
especially when the messaging was that it's about the Inflation Reduction, that, like, people are saying that everything is too high in this moment. Like, that was the intent. And then we just give tax credits where it's like, but folks don't have money right now to do those things. So it's really those who have discretionary income that can get a tax credit on the back end after they've purchased the thing. It's just...
Yeah. Last time you guys were on, you all had a good one-on-one conversation about the infrastructure bill, about Justice 40, about the Community First Infrastructure Alliance. And, it's just a revolution. There's so much discussion going on about a number of those things. But I wonder if you all have any updates from the discussion you had last time.
Yeah, the one thing that I will bring into the space is that I'm really excited by the partnership that's happening at USDOT, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, HUD, USDA, the Economic Development Administration. Early on, as soon as the bill got passed, we realized not only was there a lot of money, but there was also a lot of technical assistance dollars that were going to be issued to help to support communities across the country. And as we talked about, folks barely understood that an infrastructure bill got passed, nonetheless, the resources that could be made available to them. And so we went to the feds and we had an honest conversation about could they coordinate? And in past administrations, there were interagency programs like the Sustainable Communities Initiative and other things like that that were truly helpful and laid the foundation to a lot of the regional and community plans that we've seen over the last decade. But the intentionality to coordinate the funds is one of the hardest things within the federal government. This fall, one of the things that got announced was actually a Thriving Communities initiative that was really going to help to coordinate each of the agencies, both the rolling out of resources and also the coordination, and being able to connect their regional staff to communities on the ground, in addition to technical assistance providers being made available. So particularly because the bills were so massive, the funding was so massive, how you navigate those pieces felt so massive. Originally, we were like, who's going to help to solve for that? And it was like, the Fed should. they've got folks all across the country who actually know their programs, know the work, and know how things could potentially be done differently. And they should be part of that solution. So I'm definitely encouraged to see the transformation that's happening, even by the coordination of resources and taking in feedback. The other thing that was really powerful, in addition to the Thriving Communities Network, was actually the rollout of many of the funding opportunities that were happening on the technical assistance side. Before they actually put out the grants and some of the technical assistance requests for funding, they had meetings with stakeholders ahead of time. And they were like, what do you need? What doesn't work? They had special calls just for local communities and for providers to say, like, why doesn't it work typically for you to get this money? What could we do differently? And I feel like that's a powerful systems change, because most of the time it's a few folks in a room trying to get it done as quickly as possible, but they don't actually reach out to those who are going to have to either implement it or receive it on the back end and then have to navigate the challenges of what that looks like. So that definitely is something that I feel deeply encouraged by. And I'm hoping that it's a practice that they can continue on and that folks at the state and local level could consider implementing as well.
And one of the things that for me, what I've been holding over this last year, like sort of lessons learned, as we talked about all of those dollars being able to go out, the thing that you're hearing time and time again is that folks are not ready to receive the money, absorb the money, or even understand what the money is. And what I hold is a little bit to Stephanie's point, like folks are not prepared, but I do feel like folks within the administration are really being reflective about that and what they've learned over the COVID relief dollars coming out. So if you are not prepared, then how do we get you prepared? So when we talk about a lot of those technical assistance programs, whether it's been in USDA or DOT or DOE, a lot of those dollars are really centering what's the technical assistance that's necessary for communities, for cities to be ready to be able to absorb money and then be able to implement and ideate on those dollars. And I think that's actually, like Stephanie said, like that is a great trend. But the thing that I think is necessary for us to hold lessons learned over the last year is that a lot of places aren't ready. So we can aspirationally say there's a lot of money for infrastructure, but the capacity that is necessary and the bench that's necessary to be able to move on that isn't there. So being able to connect with some of these TA dollars, I think that might be a way to be able to address this for many of these folks.
Why does this matter is the question that I ultimately was hoping that we could answer. And it's because it takes a moment for a president to sign a bill, but it takes years and really decades to undo the harm that it creates. So when I think about the all above strategy around the energy portion of the Inflation Reduction Act. And when I think about the lack of true accountability to state DOTs to center and do a level of community engagement processes, while the bill may be signed and there's full celebrations for ribbon cuttings, if we don't actually pay attention and at the front end hold those who are in the decision-making powers, whether it's the governors, whether it's the state DOTs, accountable for the funding that are our taxpayer dollars that are going to roll back into our states and into our communities without a full plan, like, we have to wake up to this because it's going to take so much longer to stop these projects. So if we can get ahead of it and help to shape and inform those agendas, then I think it could be a great opportunity. And I just want to give some examples. Like in Arkansas, they literally put together an advisory committee when they were thinking about the recovery funding for COVID. And they were the ones who were helping to advise the strategy, and it centered community leaders as part of that. In California, they've got a whole task force thinking about this work. And, I know that those are two different extremes, but it also shows the possibilities when you actually take a moment and say, we're going to put some guiding principles around these dollars that are coming through so that we don't continue to create new harm, particularly to communities who've been most impacted by past investment.
Stephanie, those are some good points that you make around how in this moment we have to really think about how we repair, how the past systems have actually done harm. But with so much money on the table, how do we actually use this moment to think about transforming the current system in order to serve people better?
Yeah, and thank you for your question. One of the things that I've been thinking about is really around how do we transform the system, right? And what does transformative justice look like as a framework related to public infrastructure more specifically, where we're actually addressing past harm and also building for the future in mind. And I think before I even answer that question, I think one of the things that I often have to sit with is like, who gets to determine what justice actually means? And I think you've said a lot oftentimes around both the who and the how, who's most impacted and how do we address those past harms so that we can then build in a more intentional way, and also understanding the why. And so for me, I feel like particularly the past few years, it's been a defining era in many ways with the emergence of both new funding, new challenges, but also new terms, particularly around the evolution of social change. We've gone from equality to equity. Justice has now emerged in everything. Jeff, I was going back through past blogs, and you've done everything from like mobility justice to transportation justice. And I'm going to add transformative justice here because I think it's important for us to really think about what we're trying to center in these conversations. And, I've got to actually give some credit to the Center for Story-Based Strategies because they often do the box where folks are standing on the box and there's a fence. And then they added the fourth box, which was really about how do we get to a space of liberation where folks are in a space where they're empowered to vision and pursue the outcomes that they see for themselves. And I'm not sure that we're there just yet, but I am hoping that we can. But I do think that it's important for us to even just get an understanding of some of these terms that we often throw out. So, when we talk about this notion of equity, because I think that's something that this president has been very intentional about racial equity, the whole of government approach for tackling past harm, but also addressing and tackling climate change. I think it's important for us to separate out some of those terms and then also think about where we need to be evolving to in many ways. And that who, Helen, that I think that you often talk about is that framing around the distributive, either equity. I'm going to really think about it from a justice space of who is most harmed and how do we address it. There's this whole piece around like procedural justice, like the process, right? So I think, Jeff, when you asked the question about New Orleans and what was happening and like, how do we make sure that we're centering communities who have been most harmed, in these solutions and like make sure that their voice is heard, like that is really a procedural piece of determining like how fairly are people treated in this process and what do we put in place to ensure that they are represented, that their voice is part of and centered into those pieces. And then I think where the line starts to delineate between the justice framework and the equity framework is like really the structural pieces when we start to talk about equity. For justice, what you often get in addition to repairing past harm, you have a whole body of folks who are also talking about like what restorative justice looks like. And that's like that relational work that needs to happen. It's really hard to do work in communities at times because they don't trust the government. Some advocates may not trust themselves as part of that conversation. And so what does that look like to have a space where folks can actually build intentionally, collaboratively, and because the commitment is to really address those who've been most impacted and the harm created, there's a recentering and an acknowledgement that, hey, we didn't get this right. We may be experts in a lot of ways, but we know that there are other ways that we can think about it and bring a level of humility to the work. And then for me, I think where the restorative justice work and the transformative justice really comes to is that restorative justice is at that individual or community level where it's an individual or a government that has done harm. But the transformative justice is saying, hey, we're going to actually allow for the system that was the origin of the harm. It's really thinking about the collective, like DOTs across this country, the US Department of Transportation, really thinking about how do we address past harm and really transform the system to center those who have been most impacted. And I have to bring in a good book because I know, Jeff, you love to reference some good reads. And so there's a great book that says We Do This Until We Are Free by Miriam Kaba. And one of the things that she has in it that I've been sitting with is that a system that never addresses the why behind the harm never actually contains the harm itself. And let me say that again, a system that never addresses the why behind a harm will never actually contain the harm itself, meaning that it will continue to do harm unless you actually address the why it actually harms people in this moment. And I don't know that we do the work to investigate the why we're seeing all of the issues that are playing itself out with air pollution or tailpipe pollution that happens in communities. Like we know at the highest levels, but I don't know that we've also solved for a different type of solution. And we actually haven't had the space to reimagine in an intentional way because we haven't been in relationship with each other. We haven't actually created and fostered the spaces for us to have that type of conversation. So I've really been thinking about kind of 3 pillars, just to sum this up, to really thinking about and centering the why, listening to those and understanding those who have been most harmed and understanding the root cause, the why behind it, really building the capacity of support to actually intervene and address those past harms so that we don't continue to build more of the same. And I think ultimately, through the intentional work of acknowledging and then addressing those harms, we will actually have a better infrastructure outcome where we can all thrive. And I think that's the piece that sometimes gets hard, particularly when we talk about justice, because people have what is actually termed as the retributive justice in their minds. That's the there's punishment because you've done this. And I don't know if community can hold government accountable for the punishments. We can barely hold the fossil fuel companies to that level. But I do think that if we can also push to a new way to say, hey, let's actually address these pieces and put the resources behind it and intentionally center those who have been most harmed to also be part of the solution, we will get different outcomes. And I do feel confident about that.
And for us, as we think about what's next for the work for Communities First, a lot of what we're thinking about is like, how can we be able to support space where we're seeing transformative justice leadership actually rise to the top and be the ones holding and moving this forward. And to that end, one of the things that we're doing at Communities First is launching a restorative justice leadership cohort with public sector practitioners who work in transportation, housing, water, and other infrastructure. The idea is for them to actually begin to do some cross-sectoral learning. I think that is one of the things that will be key. As Stephanie mentioned earlier, communities don't live single issue lives, but the way that the system is set up is that we look at those issues individualistically and not think about like how they are actually braided together to be able to impact a community or to support a community. So the first thing is making sure that this cohort is working in an intersectional way to think about those issues, and then giving them space to be able to learn from one another, to be in group discussions, and then also to think about, when we talk about the systems of governance, like how that then plays itself out in a different way. That's one side of it. And then the other piece that we will continue to do is think about how do we actually elevate the work to reimagine a different future at the community level. So communities have been radically reimagining all over the place. Stephanie teases me all the time, as does many of our movement advocates, of like we got a plan, Helen, the plan's on the shelf. The problem is not that we haven't radically imagined, it's that we've never been given space to actually ideate on that. So a lot of what we will be doing the next year is really thinking about, like, how do we elevate existing body of work that you're seeing in frontline communities so that they get integrated into the public planning process, and that there are incentives for this to happen. Because now what happens is cities do master planning, and a lot of times those most impacted communities, they are put upon by that master planning. They are never asked to co-create that process. So we're defining ways where we can integrate the work that folks have been doing on the ground with those planning processes.
And I want to add that in addition to the space, it's the resources to do the work. And so to the extent that those who are going to have access to these federal fundings, these state and local resources, are really thinking about how they fund community and their time and making sure that they can be part of the process, I think that's another emerging practice that we are going to be helping to nurture and cultivate over the next year. The only other piece that I didn't get a chance to mention is actually a reflection a little bit on this governor's race. I think that there was a lot talked about and is still being monitored related to Congress and what it means for the Senate and the House. But the thing that I've been most watching is the governor's races. 36 governors were up for election this cycle, the majority of them running for re-election. 8 governors, chose not to. So that was really where the seats were up. And there's still some decisions for who are the final choices. But these were the governors who were in power. And, I think that's the space that I'm really thinking about, because they now are into their second term. Many of them are going to be term limited. The majority of them now have an opportunity to really ferment their legacy as leaders who managed and implemented through great crisis, but also the greatest opportunity to build a better future for both our country and their residents. And so I'm really just excited, because I think that if folks really want to be intentional about the work, we could really see the change that we need happening at that state and local level by the governors who have been now elected. And as I shared, many of them showed us that they can do this work to center those who are most impacted and do the level of community engagement that's needed that really moves towards a transformative justice outcome.
That's really interesting and important. I actually mentioned this morning in my newsletter, specifically kind of some of the races that maybe some folks were kind of paying attention to, which is the governors, right? Everybody's paying attention to the Senate and the House and all that stuff. But, in Massachusetts, you have a new Democratic governor who is likely to focus more on transportation. You have in Oregon, a Democratic governor who is likely not to turn back some of the reforms that have been created in the last few months in terms of parking reform and those types of things. You have a new governor in Maryland, where the old governor did some horrible things. Cutting the red line was one of the most egregious things that I can remember in terms of transportation policy, something that was going to help a lot of communities.
And don't forget Maryland, also the rain tax.
The rain tax as well, yeah, stuff like that. In New York, the governor is in control of the MTA. And so I know these are transportation-specific examples, but I think that if you look only to the federal level, you do so at your own peril.
Completely agree.
One of the things for me is that much of the folks within our community, specifically the climate community, are really excited about the Inflation Reduction Act. And the thing that I hold is that is really looking at some of the mitigation pieces of it. But in order for us to have the most significant bang for the buck on the climate side, that infrastructure bill actually is the place that has the most teeth, because they are putting a significant amount of resources. Half of it is going to the Department of Transportation. And the Department of Transportation, in reality, because of land use, because of transportation policy, because of fuel, are actually holding a lot of what we would be solving for on the climate side. So there's a real opportunity to really laserly focus, especially folks within the climate community, of like how do we make sure that we're elevating climate in that transportation work, because that's where we're going to get the most bang for the buck. It's not the IRA. The IRA is really on the mitigation side. It's not thinking about the mitigation, the adaptation, and the resiliency in the way that we could do with the build money.
And that's interesting too, because I actually asked Congressman Blumenauer last week at Revolution this question about, some of the guidance that folks like, Stephanie Pollack have put out related to measuring greenhouse gas emissions and state spending, and the pushback that they've been getting from some of the folks on the other side of the aisle. And I think that's really an interesting point about trying to make sure that, our land use and transportation decisions are huge climate impacts because of the amount of emissions that come from the transportation sector, specifically personal passenger vehicles. And I think that doesn't necessarily get enough play when you're talking about climate. In the Inflation Reduction Act, you have a lot of tax credits and things for solar and for wind and other, kind of generation, infrastructure. But the stuff that seems to matter a lot is, housing and the transportation, and feels like that sector over there, the energy sector, seems to be starting to move, but the transportation sector seems stuck. And I think part of that is because there hasn't been enough intentionality about focusing on climate in that space. And I think part of that is from the state DOT perspective, they are kind of an autopilot. They have been doing the same thing for such a long time that to be told you need to measure greenhouse gas emissions is to them a egregious injustice. And that's frustrating, I think, for a lot of us who see the transportation as, and the, related land use as the way to drive down VMT, which in turn could drive down emissions.
And I think the solution that everybody is rallying around, even in this moment around transportation, is like EV infrastructure. And it's like, that's great, but that's actually not going to get us to where we need to go to, even if we had everyone buy themselves, whatever the next electric vehicle needs to be. I think being able to be clear that we do have to invest in more transit, and we need to make sure that we're thinking about the housing options around, communities and what's being built out. Like, those pieces are also the pieces that are missing. And I'm encouraged because one of the things that was in the last appropriations funding that was released early this year was that Thriving Communities program that brought DOT and HUD together to start to think about land use. That, we haven't seen that before. So there is an incentive that's happening even right now to have that conversation, but that was a $30 million program. And 30 million sounds like a lot of money, but not when we're talking about trillions in this moment and what could be really invested in communities.
And when we see the trend of where people are migrating toward, those places are not overdeveloped. And as we're thinking about development, rather than let's think about the Triangle District in North Carolina. If we were conscious 10 years, 15 years ago, what we would be doing is thinking about how to do more thoughtful planning so that it was more compact. Now it's going to be harder to unravel, but places like North Carolina, you're seeing people moving also to the Midwest. There's an opportunity now to get ahead of that and thinking about how we plan for those cities in a way that they're more walkable and we're addressing VMT. But the entry point always is, development's happening. I'm going to build roads, and then I'm going to put where people live at the end of that highway. We could be reimagining as we think about the trends on where people are moving to get ahead of that, I think.
Where can folks find you if they want to find out more information about what you're doing?
Stephanie at communitiesfirst.us.
Helen Chin at communitiesfirst.us.
And I think I'm on Twitter. It's at simply SJG.
If it still exists by the end of the week.
That part.
We'll see. Well, Helen and Stephanie, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting us back.
Thanks, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at TheOverheadWire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.